Can you guys hear me at home?
I can.
Mackenzie, I saw your name come up. Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Can I hear you? That may be the question.
I can hear you.
See if I can. And let's see, what do we have here? So you guys can hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, Mackenzie, thank you. All right, good. Well, I can't hear you. I don't know what the heck's going on. Maybe it's, get it up here. Well, if you need to get me, I'll keep an eye on the chat. And I'm ready to go, but I want to say one thing first. If you looked at this schedule on the syllabus, it says quiz 3 today, but I'm not going to launch that. We'll do that when we come back. I want you guys to finish up the papers and turn them in and then have a good break. And so it's so. Any questions? No. What? Very good. Well, I got a question. What is an odalisque? This is what I asked you when we were here on Monday when we left. Odalisque. Oh, yeah. Kaylee. Yeah, kind of part of slave. Yeah. Thank you. You're absolutely right. And really what that is about is a kind of, as I was saying earlier, the French were really, they loved these paintings inspired by Napoleon's conquering and adventures all over the world, and especially out of the Middle East and North Africa and Egypt and places. Well, Napoleon had run into these cultures that had Bedouin cultures, I should say, that had a sultan or a sheikh, some kind of ruler, and those rulers would have a harem. And so that's what Kaylee was talking about, kind of they would get conscripted, they would be there'd be consorts, concubines. It would be called collectively a harem. And the room in which the harem would stay. And that's typically how they did it. It was not anything exclusive to the Middle East. In fact, in Asia, Chinese emperors had harems, concubines, and so on. But at any rate, the room in which they were kept was called an ADAH. And it kept all of these women away from everybody else except the Sultan. And this person is called an odalisque because she is a woman of the ADAH, Grand Odalisque. And so it was the kind of, oh, let me. There we go. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. So that's who she is. And this is what was stylish, I should say, in France at the time. And they were all about these exotic lifestyles, exotic places, places from far away. And this is an odalisque, as I said just a moment ago, but there's something peculiar about this painting. And let me point this out. Imagine what her proportions, her body proportions would be if she stood up. Is that her legs, her arms are really elongated. Her hips, look at how she would be like extremely wide at the hips. All of this is exaggerated, the length of her legs. And for example, like this leg here, you would follow that thigh, it would come all the way up to here, which is like kind of doesn't particularly connect. There's some anatomical issues. David.
Yeah, I didn't see her first, but now that you pointed out that leg crossing over right,
It is weird. Absolutely. And if you take a look at the other upper leg on that's underneath, that's not foreshortening, it just really kind of, again, not proportional. We wouldn't let you do this in figure drawing class. That's for sure. But there was a kind of ideology at play here. And Ang was a member, a very highly respected member of the French Academy. And as such, they'd like to place emphasis on particular elements of art. When we started talking and saw the Khan Academy video about formal analysis, this one, if you analyze it formally, you see that everything is quite clearly out of proportion. But what the artist of the Academy, and especially Ang, was very keen on was line. And to the point where they said, it doesn't really matter if things are in proportion. What is the most important aspect of a painted picture is line. And so that's what the emphasis is on here, even though accentuating the line ends up making the figure seem out of proportion. When we saw Oath of the Horatii, they broke that down into formal analysis. Just Monday. I'm hoping it's still fresh in your mind. And they talked about the orthogonals all coming up to the point where the father has the swords in his hand. But they also talked about the curvilinear lines of the women and children off on the lower right-hand part of the painting and on the left part of the painting, as well as in the center, the lines were quite straight. They were rigid. And so this is something that's kind of twirling around in art making at this time. Line is important, even if they're implied line, like the orthogonals of David, the curvilinear of the women and children, or the rigidness of the Horatii. Same thing happening here. Line. And so this is formal analysis, and this kind of goes to your question, David, about the paper too. This is kind of the same thing I'm talking about, stylistic issues. And so I wanted to add something to this. So that's and line is important. It is the most important aspect of a painting. But these academic artists also had ideas about color. And if you were to take a look at the coloration of this painting, how would you describe it? Let's just divide color right down the middle. Warm or cool?
Her body's very warm, and then like everything else is kind of cool color. That's how.
Yeah, and I think the body, actually, you're right, Wes, absolutely. It's in all of these blues and stuff, and you find a lot of that, you find a lot of cool colors. Her body's warm, but partly how her body gets to some of that warmth is because it contrasts that cool color. Now, her body is warm, but you don't really see a lot of outright reds in this painting. Maybe on the feather fan here and a little bit here. It's exotic stuff here. Let's see what I'm pointing to. A big old opium pipe. Whoa. Foreign, exotic. And so you can see, and she's got jewelry and stuff. It's a grand odalisque. She's the Sultan's favorite consort, if you will. And so anyway, that's a formal analysis. And that is the subject matter. And so what we have here, as I was saying on Monday, these ideas of neoclassicism and romanticism, they kind of bleed together. It's hard to say that one is exclusively romantic or exclusively neoclassical. But I think on the whole, we would say this is more neoclassical. It's composed, it's got cool colors, it has an emphasis on line. John Henry Fuseli, The Nightmare. Now we would talk about this as being more romantic. And in part, the subject matter, the nightmare. And here you have this woman who is deep in sleep, perhaps even perhaps even knocked out, maybe even dead, I don't know. But you have on top of her this gremlin type figure, and you have over here a bull. And Romanticism, instead of looking to the classics quite as much, they start looking at other subjects and different ways to describe those subjects. And as Neoclassicism was about order, cool colors, line, stable compositions, the Romantics were really much more interested in the emotional response of the viewer. It was there to evoke an emotion, to scare people, or make them angry, or maybe even inspire them to revolution. And so this is early Romantic art and Ancient of Days, William Blake. Early Romantic, where it's the Romantic actually comes out of a response to the age of enlightenment. And we saw last week these age of enlightenment paintings, Richard Wright of Derby, the experiments, the neoclassicism of democracy, of Plato's Republic, of independence, and all of this other stuff comes right out. And so it was all rational, it was all logical. It was the age, quote, of enlightenment, where all of this learning and all of this learned thinking goes to what you would call, you would go back to ancient Roman mythology, would be the Apollonian version, where logic rules. On the other side is the Dionysian side, which is the emotional, the intuitive. And that's really kind of the separation between neoclassicism and romanticism. And so we got things here just like this. These are things that don't really exist. And this, too, Ancient of Days. This is actually God himself. And that is romanticism. And so we just saw a couple of romantic artworks. One of the great romantic painters of the era, Francisco Goya. And this is a print, by the way. And it says, the sleep of reason produces monsters. It is a print. We've seen some prints. We saw that from William Hogarth, who actually made prints. And his were about moral lessons and virtues and things. This is more like Fuseli. When you go to sleep, all of the monsters come out. This is about the intuitive. These are about the things you can't see. This is the intuitive. This is the dream state. And I got to add to this. This is why this period of time becomes so important to study, because a century and a half later, we're going to see surrealism. And those artists will be making art about things that do not exist. They will be mining, if you will, their dreams for subject matter. We'll talk about that after the break, but there's no such thing as melted clocks hanging over bare trees like Salvador Dali would paint. That's all from the subconscious mind. That's all from the dreams. The sleep of reason produces monsters. And so it's an acknowledgement in your waking state, in your rational state, when you're fully aware, it is the Apollonian. When you sleep, when you dream, when you tap into your feelings, it is the Dionysian. And so, Goya, he was the court painter for Charles IV, King of Spain. And as we talked about before, a number of kings, royalty had court painters. Henry VIII had Hans Holbein as his court painter. For example, bottom line, Goya was the court painter for the King of Spain. And here is his family portrait. And kind of like what we saw with Velázquez and Las Meninas, where it was kind of a snapshot kind of portrait. It kind of didn't catch them all posed, sitting at the throne, sitting in royal elegance, ceremonial poses. This is like the family. They just kind of walked in and here they are. And here is Goya himself actually making the painting. That's a Velázquez thing as well. And so a lot of people have talked about this painting, of course, because Goya is a great and important painter. But they talk about this painting as not only catching this in a candid sort of way, kind of like a snapshot, it also catches them as significantly not royal, not regal. They all seem kind of plain. And here's the king, and he just kind of got this blank look on his face, like he's thinking about something else. And even some scholars have referred to this as he painted Charles IV. He looks more like a grocery store owner than the King of Spain. And his wife, the Queen, look at her. She's looking back and she kind of looking like, what are you guys doing? You know, she looks very judgmental, looks very, giving us this condescending look. And then the kids are all kind of milling around, and we got the mother-in-law back here, and we got some of the other members of the royal family, but Goya he ends up being, he's the court painter for Charles IV, but he also does a lot of work on the side. And one of those pieces is this, the 3rd of May, 1808. And this is Romanticism full blown. As I was saying, it's there to an appeal to the emotions. This is not something that one should take lightly, you think? Bottom line, this is a scene of Napoleon's troops, and they've taken over this village, and this is one of those horrible scenes. And we got this going on right now in the Ukraine, by the way. A lot of this stuff, it seems to be very timely. But Napoleon's troops, they take over this village, this city. And somebody kills one of Napoleon's troops, sniper from the balcony, boom, kills one of the French soldiers. And so what do? They line up the men in the village and they say, we're going to shoot you one by one until somebody turns in the culprit who shot one of our soldiers. Now that 1808, you can look at, you're a historian, you know about World War II. That kind of war crime happened a lot in Europe. The Nazis were that way. And they're talking about the Russians not being particularly different than that. There's a lot of comparison. So that's what's going on. And you can see they've already been through a few guys. They've got some dead bodies and blood all over the place. And this guy in the center, and he's lit. It's almost like a divine light. He is the focus of the painting. And he's defiant. Go ahead, shoot me. I'll die for my country, but I will never give up the name of the guy who shot your soul. And so that's really what this is about. You got other people and they're hiding their eyes and they're afraid and stuff. But this is a true patriot, a brave young man. And so a moment ago, I talked to you about all of the blues in Ong's paintings and all of the muted colors. Well, these guys, these romantic artists really went after color in a big way, and they delighted in using reds and yellows and bright colors for its emotional effect. And so I don't know how much you guys have studied or even how you study color in this day and age, because there's a lot of things associated with color. But in a basic fundamental way, red implies strong feelings. Red is associated with anger and heat. When tempers flare, wow, that's a heat thing, you know. Our language still reflects that kind of color temperature sensitivity. And the other thing is we talk about blues as being cool, chilly, icy, you know. So anyway, this is really where a lot of that kind of idea starts to influence artist decisions about how they put these paintings together. And so you'll see that a lot. Here's another Goya, Saturn devouring one of his children. And it's a moral statement, and it is out of, Saturn was a Greek god, a Roman god, based on Greek mythology, but it was a Roman version. And it's a parable, it's a story. And it's about the ugliness and the wrongness of eating your young. Of course you wouldn't eat your young. No, that's just not going to happen. But yes, David.
Like it's the body of a child.
Yeah. I think you're right on with that. That's a good observation. And like you know, a lot of times when these artists are kind of swept up in giving you a logical, cool response that they're looking for, or a very heated or very angry response. A lot of times, those proportions go out the window. And so that you kind of get some of that here. This is, like you say, spatially, that doesn't really make as much sense. But the point is these crazy eyes and the blood and the just plain wrongness of eating your young. Now, this is kind of way too graphic, but the moral of this story is about eating your young. People talk about us. I'm a baby boomer, right? And to some extent, we've been, as an allegory, we've been eating our young too. Not like I am doing cannibalism. But bottom line is that we've done a lot of damage to the planet. And that is a metaphor for eating your young. And so we've used up a lot of the Earth's resources. We've polluted the air. We've got it to a point where we actually have global warming. The future looks pretty bleak unless we do something about it now. And that is, metaphorically, eating your young, if you will. And so, and it is a fresco and later detached and mounted on canvas too. So these things undergo changes. But bottom line, romanticism, as I was talking about, the dream paintings, Theodore Jericho, Insane Woman. If you're about the opposite of logic and reason, the insane is the polar opposite of that. And I think that goes to what David noticed about these eyes. This is like insane craziness. But this is a portrait of an insane woman. And if you know about the 19th century, there was a lot of pseudoscience in those days. And they had these ideas that by looking at one's face, you could know that person's personality. And there were these things that you could analyze facial features and put them into personality types. They used to have this other pseudoscience that was called phrenology, Phrenology. You know about that, Wes?
What is it?
Phrenology.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, it's 19th century. It's it's debunked science. But it was where I got somebody here. Anyway, bottom line, phrenology was where they would take calipers and they would measure the size and shape of your skull to determine how smart you were. And that was something that came up in the 19th century, and it persisted even through like the Nazi era. A lot of those Nazis thought this was actually good science. And then they would have all of these diagrams about the different kind of lobes and things that you might have on your skull and so on, the shape of your skull. Determinative. But at any rate, this is a painting, Insane Woman, and the idea that this is polar opposite of all of this Age of Enlightenment. There is another side, the Dionysian side, not the Apollonian. This is about the inner workings. And this, again, like I said, the Romantics will give way to the Surrealists. Actually, the surrealists in the early 20th century were very interested in the insane. And in fact, one of one of the great surrealists, Andre Breton, who was a writer, talked about insanity as the greatest revolt against logic and reason, as though insanity was a choice. Now we have all kinds of different, more appropriate ideas about mental health and things too, but at any rate, this is where they were in the 19th century. And so this is Theodore Jericho and charging Cheshire. And you can compare this to David's Napoleon crossing the Alps. But this is there's a lot more action, a lot more use of reds, and a lot more death and destruction here. You see these armies here, all of this is on fire and stuff. So anyway, Jericho was a painter, and he was very much interested in how to affect the emotions of the viewer. And that leads to this. And when you saw the inside of the Louvre in the Khan Academy video, this was on the wall. Of course, I can pick them out because I've been living with these for a few decades. Raft of the Medusa, 1818, 1819. Look at the size of this thing, 16 feet high, 23 and a half feet wide. It is huge. As was the Oath of the Horatii. There was this idea of bigger is better. And that was kind of something that happens in the early 18th century. I'd like to refer to it unscientifically as IMAX. That they would make these paintings so large that a viewer would feel very small looking at these gigantic paintings. But this Raft of the Medusa, this was meant to stir the emotions, and it came right out of the newspapers of the day. I showed you Watteau. Should we, or is there guys bothering you back to? Okay. They're kind of distracting me. It's like, I'm gonna go out, play Frisbee, come on. But if you, no, you don't have to do anything. But you saw the pilgrimage to Cythera, and I was talking about this is what the wealthy did, and they went on cruises and pleasure cruises, and that's something that middle class people do today. And what we have here in the early 19th century is sort of the emergence of a middle class. And so people can start doing things like pleasure cruises. The Medusa was a pleasure cruise ship. And it was not properly vetted, it was not properly inspected, and it sank. And the survivors got together and they put together this raft, which was really part of the ship, and they fashioned the sail, and they were stuck out there on the high seas for quite a length of time. And they were finally rescued. Actually, there's a couple of versions of this, and one of them being where the rescue ship is on the horizon. I don't think this is got that, but yeah, that might be this right here. But talking about things, look at this. He's got dead bodies hanging off the side. We've got people dying. They're starving. And when they find them, they're just a handful of survivors. And they talked about how one of the ways that the survivors were able to make it was that they resorted to cannibalism. So this hit the French papers, and it was a big scandal. It was huge. And there was a lot of blame to go around, but mostly about the government and how they let these ships go out with all these people and not even inspecting them to make sure that they're seaworthy. Just saying. But the idea that these people would resort to cannibalism itself was a big scandal too. And so these things happen from time to time. There was a big one later in the 19th century of some American settlers traveling west on the Oregon Trail going to California, got in the Rocky Mountains, got caught in a snowstorm. They were called the Donner Party. If you look this up, you can Google it. And they had it was the same kind of tragedy that they were stuck in the blizzard. They had to resort to cannibalism and stuff like that. There was a plane crash in the 1970s in the Andes with a soccer team. And they resorted to cannibalism. Ate the dead, stay alive. So anyway, as you can see, these are things that happen from time to time, but they are sensational. Why, even the word sensation points to the idea of romanticism. It is sensational. It is there to affect your emotions. And so anyway, this is one of the great romantic paintings of the age. And probably the biggest romantic artist of the era is this guy, Delacroix. And this is The Death of Sardanapalus. And this is, as I was saying earlier, when we looked at the Grand Odalisque, this is what this looks like. There's the Sultan, Sardanapalus, and these are his harem. These are his soldiers. And so what is going on here? Well, the enemy has breached the city walls. Sardanapalus is doomed. And rather than give up his treasure and his harem to the enemy, he kills him. And that's what's happening here. See that knife? Kapow. Yeah. He's killing off his harem. He's has his servants killing his horses, get rid of the wealth, actually, and burning the place down. And here is Sardanapalus just kind of quietly watching all of this. Sensational. But it's exotic. It is basically the kind of thing that should rile your emotions. Just think about somebody so unfeeling, so self-centered, that he would just have all of these people just killed. And again, not very stable in the composition, a lot of curvilinears all over the place, just agitating your eyes with line, with color. And when you take a look at this, the color, it's predominantly warm to incite those feelings. And so during this period, Delacroix and they actually had public disputes, public debates about what art should be. And Delacroix would talk about color, Ang would talk about line. And it was really a discussion of the Dionysian versus the Apollonian. And so anyway, yeah, this is the death of Sardanapalus and the scenes from the Massacre of Chios. Again, not a particularly heroic battle. And in fact, what you see are people actually battle weary, dying, dead mama, baby. This is not the heroism of war. This is the agony of war. And so, Delacroix, liberty leading the people. And this is one of Delacroix's more famous works. And the idea of liberty, as I mentioned it several times, that was a Greek idea. That was an idea that comes out of ancient Greece. Liberty, the republic, etc., people governing themselves, right out of ancient Greece. And so this is kind of, in its own way, a depiction of ancient Greek neoclassical ideas. But on the other hand, it's done in a purely romantic way. And so liberty leading the people, this is not that statue that's sitting out in the harbor, New York City, where she's fully clothed and holding up a torch. Here she is holding the French flag, leading the people in the French Revolution. And on top of which, this is kind of all there to incite or inspire an emotional response. Even liberties are tops down. I mean, you know, it's kind of classical and kind of romantic. This is what I'm talking about. The romantic and a neoclassical sometimes are a little hard to tease out one from the other. But because of all of the death, all of the bloodshed, and the very busy, frenetic composition, romantic. Eugene Delacroix, romantic painter, French 19th century. And again, they liked this stuff that was exotic, foreign, the tiger hunt. Wow, check this out. We're trying to hunt the tiger with a spear. The tiger's not going easily. The tiger's like biting the leg off of the horse. This guy's trying to stay on top of his mount and trying to kill this tiger. Do you remember that Assyrian relief of the lion hunt? Yeah, totally different. Totally, almost extremely different. And so anyway, and again, curvilinear line, lots of warm color. Exotic scenes from faraway places. And women of Algiers in their apartment. And this is kind of like the odalisque. This is kind of interesting too. We believe this to be a maidservant, and we believe these women to be consorts or concubines of some sort. Got a hookah going here. It's the opium dens that they talked about of the Middle East. But again, warm color, emotional, exotic, and
It's basically the same subject matter that we saw with the Grand Order list, but in a lot of ways, entirely different in how it's depicted. And so the romantic inspires a lot of sculpture. And again, bottom line, see, this is from the Arc of Triomphe. And the Arc of Triomphe is actually, it's a neoclassical Roman triumphal arch. So, like I said, you can't really separate out the romantic from the neoclassical. They both play a big part in what influences art of the time. Caspar David Friedrich, Abbey in the Oak Forest. And this is like typical Friedrich. And you see these scenes and they look gloomy in the darkness of winter and cold and isolated. This and ruins. Big Friedrich subject matter. Here's another Friedrich too. Wanderer above the sea of mist. Okay. I was checking to see. There's a lot of these paintings, but one of the subjects that romantic artists portray, they get really involved in this, is nature. Not just on a small micro scale of doing illustrations of plants and stuff like we've seen, but more about the overwhelming forces of nature, as nature as its own life, the world as having great and immense power. And weather is probably, and the oceans too, good examples of the sublime power of nature. And sublime is a word that's often used with this kind of romanticism. Anybody know the dictionary definition of sublime?
Not the band.
Yeah, no, it's a cool name too. Sublime. Well, it basically just means awe-inspiring, sublime. And so when you think about God, God is sublime, awe-inspiring, things that are bigger than yourself. And so this is a German romanticism, English romanticism. And this is Constable the Haywain. And this is out in the English countryside. And this is the cottage and the Haywain's right here. It's got the draft horses. And this is, half of this picture is the cloud formations. And so Constable was very interested in actually depicting these accurately. In fact, these are so accurate that scholars can go back and they know when these were painted and they can kind of recreate weather patterns of, in this case, the 1820s. But this is the idea of man living in harmony with the sublime forces of nature. And this is J.M.W. Turner. And he does the sublime forces of nature and how small we are. So we compare to those. So what we see here, nature overwhelming the people, this man facing the sublime forces of nature, harmony with nature, and in this case, the slave ship. Slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. And what you got here is
something that came, again, like the raft of the Medusa, came right out of the headlines, out of what was happening at the time. These guys in the ship were slave traders that go to West Central Africa, catch all of these people who have been captured and enslaved, and they, for profit, carry those people over to the Americas for slave labor. But the typhoon is hitting, and so in order not to go under, they get the ship, they lighten the load so it won't sink, and that's what's happening here. See, this is, you can see in this is really, you can see some of the chains and stuff that are kind of being thrown over, and some of the other stuff. But that's really what's going on. And over here, look at this. God coming to retrieve the dead. Those poor souls to heaven. And so, yeah, sublime nature. Thomas Colby Oxbow, and that's title for this bend in the river. After thunderstorm. I want to tell you something about this. How many of you are familiar with Henry David Thoreau on Walden Pond? Can you guys see that? Anyway, Thoreau was an American writer, and he moves away from the city, which in the early United States really wasn't that hard to do. And he went out to this place outside of Boston in Massachusetts, Walden Pond. He wrote this great account of his time and his thoughts from Walden Pond. Now, basically what he's considered to be as a romantic author. So he's kind of in his own way, like these painters we're looking at. And Thoreau wanted to get away from, quote, civilization and figure out how to live in harmony with nature. In fact, we still look at Thoreau's on Walden Pond for a lot of tips and you might call him actually an early environmentalist because he was actually pretty appalled at what was happening in this so-called civilization and industrialization and so on. But bottom line is that this is a movement that captures literature, and captures artists too. And so frequently, like you see after the thunderstorm, but look, this thunderstorm is like extremely powerful. Then you can see here that this thunderstorm that is just passing through here has already destroyed some of the trees and the foliage. And this is kind of an interesting little part here too. Here is Cole's backpack, his brushes, his paint, sketchbook, and a parasol, an umbrella to protect him from the sun. And here he is down there. And presumably trying to find a place. Paint. Now these guys, these are what guys will call the Hudson River School, and their paintings were typically landscapes in kind of the American romantic movement, like Thoreau. They were called the Hudson River School, And what they did was actually go up into northern New York. And they actually kind of just made sketches and stuff. That's why you don't see it easily. You take a look at this. This is 4 feet by 6 feet. So this would have been kind of a substantial canvas to be dragging around in the woods, if you will. But what they did was make sketches and notes of the landscapes, and they went back into their studios in New York. And like in France, people were really interested in artists painting subjects that were exotic and foreign. And to a lot of the city dwellers in places like New York and Boston, this was exotic. This was great. Albert Bierstadt, this is actually much later, but that continues in America. Romantic landscape paintings. And this is in California, among the Sierra Nevada mountains, California, 1868. And it is a wonderful painting of the beauty, the natural beauty of the American West. Now and it is that. I mean, these are just magnificent paintings, and they're typically, like a lot of this stuff, 6 feet by 10 feet. It's a huge painting. And again, nature is supreme. The mountains, the sky. You see the elk down here, but they're actually pretty tiny. And in some of these Bierstadt paintings, you'll see some indigenous people. They'll also be very small by comparison because they're vast panoramic landscapes. Beautiful. And will inspire more American artists. Ansel Adams of the 20th century will photograph some of these same places. He was all about the natural beauty of the American West and so on. Now, there's a lot of criticism in today's scholarship about these Bierstadt paintings. And the scholarship says that these paintings kind of served as postcards, as travel log brochures to show Americans, quote, back east, how wonderful and how idyllic things are in the American West. And after the Civil War, you find people like Horace Greeley saying famously, "Go west, young man." And you see that Abraham Lincoln had started the Transcontinental Railroad. You see that there's this idea of a manifest destiny. They want to settle, they want Europeans to go out and settle the West. And so these paintings kind of served as inspiration for a lot of people to go west. Let's remember the Donner Party, who things didn't quite work out. And like I say, you see the wildlife, the land of plenty of fresh water. We got some game birds down here. It's just like so beautiful. And oftentimes when people went out into the American West, they were more living like Kevin Costner did in Dancing with Wolves, like kind of, you know. And one thing about Bierstadt, and like I said, he often has indigenous people there, but they all seem to be like quite nice and friendly and stuff. So we're not seeing like Custer and so on. Frederick Edwin Church, Twilight in the Wilderness. Another picture perfect postcard. The American West. Come out here. It's all there for you. And so, yeah, gee. I'm gonna turn a page here and it's like 8 after. This is different. Think this is different than that? Quite a bit. This is the other outgrowth and movement of the 19th century, and it's called realism. You see Romanticism, and it, like I say, kind of gets caught up and has an interface with neoclassicism. They kind of coexist, but there's another stream, another mode of thought that takes over in the late, as you can see, this is mid-century, in the mid-late 19th century. And so with that, I think we'll start on this painting after the break. Because this has a whole other set of issues. And so you guys at home, have a good break.
Thank you, you too.
You, all right. Wow, they're leaving. We're not leaving. Okay.